When we talk about World War II, certain battles stand out as turning points. Stalingrad, Normandy, Midway. But there's one clash often called the deadliest tank battle in history: Kursk. Imagine the summer of 1943. Millions of soldiers, thousands of tanks, artillery roaring across the Russian countryside. It was the largest armored engagement the world had ever seen. The Battle of Kursk was indeed just another fight. It was the moment Nazi Germany tried to regain the initiative after Stalingrad, only to be met with brutal Soviet resistance. And what makes Kursk so fascinating isn't just the scale. It's the story of strategy, deception, and sheer willpower, played out over fields scarred by trenches and steel. So tonight, let us dive deep into WW2 at Deadliest Clash, the full story of the Battle of Kursk. By early 1943, the tide of World War II was shifting. The German defeat at Stalingrad shattered Hitler's dream of quickly conquering the Soviet Union. But the German high command wasn't ready to give up. They believed one massive victory could restore momentum. Their target: a bulge in the Soviet lines near the city of Kursk, about 280 miles southwest of Moscow. This bulge, called the Kursk salient, jutted deep into German-held territory. To the Germans, it looked like the perfect place to launch a double-sided attack and trap entire Soviet armies. Hitler named the plan Operation Citadel. His idea was simple: crush the Soviets at Kursk with the largest tank assault ever seen, and prove the German army still had teeth. But there was a problem. The Soviets knew the attack was coming. Through spies, reconnaissance, and even captured documents, they had a clear picture of Germany's plans. Instead of attacking first, the Soviets decided to wait. They transformed the Kursk salient into a fortress, layering minefields, barbed wire, and trenches in ways never seen before. Entire towns and villages were reshaped into strongholds. Farmers and civilians worked alongside soldiers, digging anti-tank ditches and laying hundreds of thousands of mines. In total, the Soviets prepared 8 defensive lines, some stretching over 150 miles. It was one of the most elaborate defensive networks ever constructed in the war. Behind those defenses, the Red Army massed reserves. Tank brigades, artillery, and infantry units waited, hidden in forests and camouflaged in fields, ready to counter-strike. The Germans, meanwhile, delayed their offensive for months, waiting for new weapons like the Panther tank and Ferdinand tank destroyer to arrive. This delay gave the Soviets even more time to fortify. What was supposed to be a surprise offensive turned into an open secret, one the Soviets were eager to exploit. By July 1943, the stage was set. The Germans assembled nearly 800,000 men, 3,000 tanks, and thousands of aircraft. The Soviets brought even more, over 1 million troops and more than 5,000 tanks. It wasn't just another battle. It was a collision of steel and manpower on a scale the world had never witnessed. Both sides knew Kursk could decide the future of the Eastern Front. For Germany, it was a last gamble to stop the Soviet advance. For the USSR, it was a chance to seize the initiative for good. And on July 5, 1943, the largest clash of tanks and soldiers in history began. At dawn on July 5, 1943, the sky lit up with artillery fire. German cannons roared, pounding Soviet defenses across the Kursk salient. Operation Citadel had begun. The German plan was a classic pincer movement. Army Group Center would attack from the north, while Army Group South pushed from the south. The goal: meet near Kursk and trap Soviet forces inside. Leading the southern attack was Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, one of Germany's best strategists. In the north, General Walter Model commanded the assault. At first, the Germans made progress. Their tanks smashed through the first Soviet defensive lines, using Tigers and Panthers to overwhelm smaller Soviet T-34s. But the Soviets had prepared for this. Behind every destroyed line was another. The Germans would capture a trench only to be hit by another wave of mines, artillery, and hidden anti-tank guns. The minefields were brutal. German engineers had to clear paths under constant fire, while Soviet snipers and machine gunners targeted them relentlessly. Despite the obstacles, the Germans pushed forward. In the south, battles raged around the village of Prokhorovka, where armored divisions clashed in open fields. Panthers, powerful on paper, proved unreliable. Many broke down before even reaching the front. Meanwhile, Soviet T-34s swarmed in large numbers, faster and easier to repair. The Ferdinand tank destroyers, heavily armored but lacking machine guns, became easy targets for Soviet infantry armed with grenades and Molotov cocktails. Still, German troops advanced. In some places, they drove 20 miles into Soviet territory, grinding forward with determination and firepower. But every step forward cost them dearly. The Soviets fought fiercely, knowing this battle could decide the war's outcome. On July 12th, the fighting reached a climax near Prokhorovka. Over 1,200 tanks clashed in what many call the largest single-tank battle in history. The fields shook with explosions, steel grinding against steel. T-34s rammed German Tigers at close range, while artillery shells turned farmland into a fiery wasteland. Neither side gained a clear upper hand that day. The Soviets lost hundreds of tanks, but so did the Germans. For Hitler's army, the losses were irreplaceable. In the north, progress was even slower. Soviet defenses were deeper, and Model's forces struggled to break through. The longer the battle dragged on, the weaker the German momentum became. Meanwhile, Soviet commanders Zhukov and Rokossovsky were waiting. They had held back massive reserves, ready to strike once the Germans exhausted themselves. By mid-July, it was clear the German offensive had stalled. They had thrown everything into the assault, but Kursk was not collapsing. It was holding. Then came the turning point. The Soviets launched their own counteroffensive, pushing back with fresh armies and overwhelming numbers of tanks. What began as Hitler's attempt to crush the Red Army was about to flip. Instead of retreating, the Soviets were preparing to drive the Germans west. The largest defensive stand of the war was about to turn into one of its most decisive counterattacks. By the second week of July, the German spearheads were slowing down. Their tanks had battered Soviet lines, but the defenses were simply too deep. Every breakthrough led to another wall of resistance. Soviet commanders had been waiting for this moment. They had deliberately absorbed the German attack, conserving strength while bleeding the enemy dry. General Zhukov, one of Stalin's most trusted commanders, believed in patience. He knew once the Germans lost momentum, the Red Army's sheer numbers could crush them. On July 12th, as the Germans fought at Prokhorovka, the Soviets unleashed Operation Kutuzov in the north, a massive counteroffensive designed to push back Army Group Center. Tens of thousands of Soviet troops surged forward, supported by fresh tank brigades and artillery. The exhausted German forces suddenly found themselves on the defensive. In the south, General Vatutin launched his own counterblow. What had been a German advance just days before now turned into desperate fighting to avoid encirclement. The sheer scale was staggering. In some sectors, Soviet infantry advanced shoulder to shoulder, backed by waves of T-34s that seemed endless compared to Germany's dwindling reserves. Air battles raged overhead. The Luftwaffe, once dominant, was now matched by swarms of Soviet aircraft. Dogfights filled the skies while ground troops battled below. For the Germans, it became clear they were fighting a losing battle. Mechanical breakdowns, fuel shortages, and constant Soviet attacks drained their strength. Meanwhile, Hitler grew impatient. With news of the Allied invasion of Sicily, he ordered forces to be pulled from the Eastern Front, weakening the Kursk offensive even further.
This decision sealed the fate of Operation Citadel. Without reinforcements, the Germans had no hope of regaining the initiative. The Soviets pressed harder. Their counterattacks pushed deep into German lines, reclaiming towns and villages that had been occupied for months. The once mighty German armored divisions were now shadows of themselves, losing tanks faster than they could be replaced. At Prokhorovka, the Germans had hoped for a decisive breakthrough.
Instead, they faced chaos, burning fields littered with wrecked tanks from both sides. Although the Soviets suffered massive losses, they could afford them. The Red Army had reserves. The Germans did not. By late July, the Soviets were firmly in control. Their lines held, their counterattacks expanded, and the Germans were forced into retreat. The psychological impact was enormous. For the first time, the Red Army had not only stopped a German offensive, it had turned it back completely. Villagers celebrated as Soviet forces liberated towns across the Kursk region. But behind the joy was devastation. Homes destroyed, fields burned, families torn apart by months of fighting. Still, Kursk marked a turning point. From this moment on, the Soviets would remain on the offensive, pushing the Germans back step by step until Berlin itself. The cost, however, was staggering. Estimates suggest over 250,000 German casualties and nearly 800,000 Soviet casualties, including soldiers and civilians. The battlefield itself became a graveyard of steel. Thousands of tanks and vehicles lay wrecked, silent reminders of the scale of the clash. Survivors spoke of the deafening roar of engines, the ground shaking from constant shelling, and the smell of smoke and oil that lingered for weeks. For tank crews, Kursk was pure terror. Many went into battle knowing they had less than a 50% chance of surviving the day. Yet the Red Army pressed on, driven by the belief that Kursk was the key to finally turning the war in their favor. And they were right. Kursk wasn't just a Soviet victory. It was the final nail in the coffin of Germany's ability to launch major offensives in the east. After Kursk, the Wehrmacht would never again take the strategic initiative. The rest of the war on the Eastern Front was a series of Soviet advances. The victory also boosted Soviet morale. Soldiers who had once feared the German war machine now believed it could be defeated, and they proved it in battle. For Germany, the loss was devastating, not just in men and machines, but in confidence. The myth of invincibility that once surrounded their panzer divisions was shattered. The Red Army now had momentum, resources, and the will to push westward. Kursk had given them the confidence to launch massive offensives that would drive the Germans back across Eastern Europe. And while the world was focused on Sicily and the Western Front, the Eastern Front had already decided Germany's fate. By August 1943, it was clear. The Battle of Kursk was a decisive Soviet victory. The Germans had gambled on one last major offensive in the east, and they had lost. For the Soviet Union, Kursk wasn't just another battle. It was proof that their army could not only defend but also launch massive counterattacks and win. After Kursk, Stalin and his generals pushed forward with confidence. Operations across Ukraine, Belarus, and eventually Poland were now within reach. For Germany, the loss was devastating. Hitler's hopes of regaining momentum on the Eastern Front had evaporated. The Wehrmacht was now forced into a permanent retreat. The myth of German armored superiority also took a hit. Tigers and Panthers, once feared as unstoppable, were now seen as vulnerable to determined Soviet defenses and swarming T-34s. Kursk also drained German resources. Thousands of tanks, vehicles, and aircraft were destroyed, losses the Reich could never fully replace. Meanwhile, Soviet industry was ramping up production at a staggering pace. For every tank Germany lost, the Soviets could build several more. The battle also shifted morale. Soviet soldiers, once on the defensive, now believed victory was possible. German soldiers, on the other hand, felt the tide of war slipping away. Western allies took notice too. The Soviet victory at Kursk coincided with the Allied invasion of Sicily, showing that Germany was now struggling on multiple fronts. Hitler grew increasingly paranoid. Blaming his generals for the failure, he interfered more in military planning, often making rash decisions that weakened Germany further. For the Soviets, Kursk marked the start of a relentless push westward. Cities like Kharkov, Kiev, and Minsk would soon fall in the months that followed. In many ways, Kursk was the true turning point of the Eastern Front. Stalingrad had stopped the Germans. Kursk broke them. The battle also showed the importance of intelligence. Soviet spies and reconnaissance gave them the edge,
while German overconfidence blinded them. Technology, too, played a role. German tanks were powerful, but complicated and prone to breakdowns. The Soviet T-34, simple and reliable, proved more effective in the long run. The human cost, however, was staggering. Nearly 3 million men fought in the battle, and close to 1 million were killed, wounded, or captured. Villages across Kursk were left in ruins,
fields scorched, and families displaced. The scars of 1943 would remain for decades. Yet from this devastation emerged a Soviet army more determined than ever. Kursk gave them the momentum to carry the war all the way to Berlin. For Germany, it was the beginning of the end. From Kursk onward, they would never again launch a major offensive on the Eastern Front. The Red Army had proven not only its resilience, but its growing dominance. The war in the East was now a Soviet-driven march toward ultimate victory. And for history, Kursk remains a symbol of endurance, preparation, and the moment the tide of World War II truly turned. The Battle of Kursk wasn't just about tanks and soldiers. It was about two ideologies clashing, two armies pushing each other to the limit, and a world watching the balance of power shift. It showed that preparation, patience, and resilience could overcome even the most feared war machine of its time. The Red Army had outlasted, and ultimately outfought the Wehrmacht. From that summer of 1943 onward, the Eastern Front belonged to the Soviets. Each push westward carried the echoes of Kursk, the battle that broke Germany's offensive spirit. Today, Kursk is remembered not just as the largest tank battle in history, but as the moment the tide of war turned irreversibly against Hitler. It reminds us that even in the darkest times, determination and strategy can change the course of history. So when we look back at World War II, Kursk stands alongside Stalingrad, Normandy, and Midway as one of the defining turning points. And while the numbers are staggering and the loss is heartbreaking, the story of Kursk is also one of endurance and resolve. It's a reminder that history is shaped not only by leaders and generals, but by the countless soldiers and civilians who endured unimaginable hardship. What do you think? Was Kursk the true turning point of the Eastern Front, or just one piece in the larger puzzle of Germany's defeat? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more deep dives into the most dramatic moments of history. Thanks for watching. Until next time.